Hi, this is Corey Franklin with Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. Tonight we're going to start out with Andy Pafko. Andy Pafko, who died recently at the age of 92. If you read the national obits on him, especially the ones in New York, you'd think that his greatest accomplishment was standing at the wall for Bobby Thomsen's home run in 1951. You remember we did Bobby Thomsen as one of our first podcasts. And indeed, Andy Pafko was the Dodgers left fielder that day, and he did watch the Giants win the pennant, as they say. In fact, Don DeLillo's novelized tale of New York in the early 50s was originally titled Pafko at the Wall before he renamed it Underworld. But a lot of that is New York provincialism, because Andy Pafko's greatest fame was as a Chicago Cub. He was one of the greatest Cubs, and he's beloved in the city of Chicago. I'll go out on a limb and call him the Cubs' greatest center fielder. That's not that much of a title, thinnest sumo wrestler, because center field was never a great position for the Cubs. You could argue for Hack Wilson, but I'm going to call Hack Wilson a corner outfielder. And they had Richie Ashburn, but that was after his prime with the Phillies. So let's call it Andy Pafko. As I said, he was beloved here in Chicago. He came from Boyceville, Wisconsin, one of your typical beautiful Wisconsin towns in western Wisconsin, about halfway between Minneapolis, St. Paul, and Eau Claire. As I said, he was a legend up there. They named a field up there after him. And one of the Boyceville residents who went to school with him prepared a short report on him, and I'm going to include a little bit of it here.
After stints in Green Bay in 1941 and Macon, Georgia in 1942, Pafko made a name for himself in 1943 when he hit .356 in Los Angeles and was the MVP of the Pacific Coast League. The Chicago Cubs called him up for the remainder of the 1943 season, and he proved he was ready. In Andy's first career Major League at-bat with the Cubs, he singled and drove in 2 runs. He hit .379 in the next 13 games. In 1945, he helped lead the Cubs to the World Series by hitting .298 and driving in 110 runs. He also starred in center field with his speed and hustle. He was a hit in Chicago and in Boyceville. In the World Series, Andy was the Cubs' starting center fielder against the Detroit Tigers. It gave everybody in Boyceville a lot to cheer about, remembering when Boyceville fans would gather around the radio to hear the World Series broadcasts. After being traded to Brooklyn in June of the 1951 season, Pafko wound up in another World Series with the star-studded Dodgers in 1952. He also was at the wall in left field when Bobby Thomsen's home run sailed over and helped the Giants win the pennant and break the Dodgers' hearts in 1951. Pafko's baseball good fortunes continued when in January of 1953 he was traded again, this time to Milwaukee. He was going home to Wisconsin, which was crazy about its new team, the Braves. How lucky could a guy get, Pafko said, about going back to Wisconsin. Pafko wound up in 2 more World Series with the Braves, helping them win it all in 1957 when he played in 83 games and batted .277. He retired after the 1959 season, but remained involved with the Braves as an assistant coach and minor league coach in the 1960s. He eventually became a major league scout. Pafko, nicknamed Handy Andy for his ability to play outfield or third base, was one of the steadiest players during baseball's golden era. With a career .285 batting average and a .984 fielding percentage, he was named to the Dodgers Hall of Fame and Cubs Walk of Fame.
Yeah, Pafko played in 4 World Series, and he won one of them with the Braves. Of course, the one with the Cubs in '45 was when the one they lost, and that was when a lot of the retread players were playing because of World War II. I've always wondered why the Cubs traded him in '51. He was going to the Dodgers, who had Snyder in center field. And he was clearly better than most of the players the Cubs had. The Cubs were dreadful in the '50s and never figured that one out. They loved him in Milwaukee in the late '50s, too. He was Czechoslovakian, the big Slovak community in Milwaukee. But his time sort of came to an end when Hank Aaron came into his own in the outfield. Actually, I'd be curious to know how many guys played on the same team with Jackie Robinson and Hank Aaron. It's an interesting question. Anyway, that's Andy Pafko, nice Czechoslovakian boy from Boyceville, one of the greatest Cubs of all time. We're going to move on now to Scott Carpenter, one of the original Mercury 7 astronauts, who died recently at the age of 88. Scott Carpenter was the fourth American in space. He was the second to orbit the Earth after John Glenn. Carpenter and Glenn were at a 50th commemoration of their space flights last year. Glenn did most of the talking. Carpenter had had a stroke.
Roger, the clock is operating. We're underway. You're loud and clear. Roger, we're programming and roll okay.
John Glenn, the first to achieve the goal, made his pre-orbit flight in Friendship 7 on February 20th, 1962.
It's been 50 years. It's hard for me to believe that. It seems like just a couple of weeks ago to me.
3 months later, fellow Mercury astronaut Scott Carpenter followed Glenn with his flight aboard AURORA 7 on May 24th, 1962.
Yeah, Scott Carpenter was a happening dude in 1962. I remember a picture in Life magazine of him and his wife, Reen, twisting. She was a hot platinum blonde. The picture just cried out 1962. After his one flight into space, he got in a little trouble with NASA, and he became an Aquanaut. He was working on SEALAB, this underwater diving thing where they explored the ocean. So he was the only astronaut who was also an Aquanaut. Here's Brian Williams on NBC News talking about Scott Carpenter, who does a really nice job.
Scott Carpenter died today. He was the second American to orbit the Earth and the fourth American astronaut in space. He was 88 years old, a native of Boulder, Colorado, a genuine American hero who dated back to a time when we all looked up to 7 very brave men. They made America so proud back in the age of the possible. They were the Mercury 7, Shepard, Grissom, Schirra, Cooper, Slayton, Glenn, and Carpenter. And while they were young men, many had already skirted the heavens as test pilots and survived the hell of warfare. Scott Carpenter was a naval aviator, a veteran of the Korean War, the only astronaut without a college degree. He was named John Glenn's backup, so he had to wait his turn to get up to space. But at the mic that day in Mission Control, he got to utter those famous words to his friend before launch while the whole world listened in.
Godspeed, John Glenn.
When it was his turn in May of 1962, Carpenter flew in a capsule named AURORA 7. He orbited the Earth 3 times. He was up there less than 5 hours. And because of technical glitches, he landed 250 miles from the intended target. As TV viewers stared anxiously at the black and white picture, there were fears he hadn't survived the splashdown, until he was spotted almost an hour later sitting in his raft awaiting pickup. He never flew in space again, though he loved exploration. He lived for an entire month on the bottom of the ocean floor in something called SEALAB in the mid-60s. Years later, he was part of our on-air team at Cape Canaveral to cheer on his friend John Glenn, who returned to space as a shuttle astronaut at the age of 77. We're joined here by Scott Carpenter, and what do you reckon is going on in there?
I wish I knew, but I don't.
Of the original Mercury 7, now only John Glenn survives at the age of 92. The aircraft carrier that recovered Scott Carpenter's space capsule on that day in late May of 1962 lives on to this day as a floating museum here in New York, the USS Intrepid.
Yeah, as you heard there, when he landed, he was about 250 miles from where he was supposed to be in the ocean. The whole world was nervous there for a little while, but the aircraft found him pretty quickly. He wasn't especially beloved by Chris Kraft, the head of the NASA operations. Plus, there was some thought that the reason that his craft landed so far away from the landing zone was because he pointed it a little off target, and he didn't manage the deceleration that well. And those NASA guys were pretty picky in those days, you know, you couldn't mess up. Most of the retrospective accounts said he did okay, and in fact, he performed heroically. But on that kind of thing, you never know what the truth is. On top of that, he bumped Deke Slayton, who was a NASA favorite, but he had a little bit of a heart problem. So Scott Carpenter had a whole bunch of things going against him after that first mission, and he never flew again. He also had a little bit of a playboy image. You know, he rode a motorcycle, got in a motorcycle accident that didn't help him. Ultimately, he had 4 wives. I'm not sure NASA liked that kind of stuff. I think they preferred the straight-laced image of Armstrong and Glenn. Here, Scott Carpenter talks about something I didn't know, why his craft was called AURORA 7.
You called the flight, or called the spacecraft, Aurora. What's in a name? Where'd you get a name like that?
Well, there's some popular disagreement about that. I named it Aurora because I saw it as a celestial event, and the aurora borealis is a celestial event. I like the sound of it, the celestial significance. First of all, let's go into 7. Al Shepard started that with Freedom 7. And the press caught that and said, "Isn't that nice of Al to name his capsule something 7 in honor of the 7 astronauts, his buddies?" And everybody believed that. The fact of that matter is that he named it 7 because it was capsule number 7 off the line. But the people didn't know that. But since everybody wanted to match Al's largesse, Gus had Liberty Bell 7 and John had Friendship 7. So I had to do something with 7, and it was Aurora 7. But the people back home in Boulder, down on the Front Range, thought, wasn't that nice of Scott to name his capsule Aurora 7 for the fact that he was born and raised in a house in Boulder on the corner of Aurora and 7th Street. So I give you the real reason behind Aurora, but people from Boulder don't believe it.
I don't know why, I just get the feeling that Scott Carpenter was one of those hardcore Navy pilots who turned a little hippie in the 1960s. And just for the record, you knew that John Glenn would be the last surviving Mercury 7 astronaut. He was a hyper-competitive guy, and he would have done anything to outlive all the rest of those guys. Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer, Sid Tepps. Well, in 1962, the whole world was caught up in the space race and the astronauts, and one of the biggest hits of that year, it was a #1 in December that year, was a song out of Great Britain done by an English group called the Tornadoes, and it was produced by a guy named Joe Meek, who was sort of the Phil Spector of England. It was an instrumental, and it was named after the first telecommunications satellite, Telstar. We're going to play a little bit of it here, but we're not going to use the English version. If you were doing instrumentals in the early 60s, you could bet your mortgage that it was covered by the Ventures. So we're going to go with that group from the good old USA, as American as they come, the Ventures, and their version of Telstar as our final tribute to the Mercury 7 astronaut, Scott Carpenter.